Welcome to the Exam 1 review. Let me first apologize for missing class Thursday evening. That's never happened before to me, but I had a genuine family emergency successfully resolved, I'm happy to report. And I knew that Dr. Meadow was lecturing and I wasn't really needed, so I chose to deal with the family emergency and just let him have it. That does create one challenge for me, and let me talk about how I'm going to give the exam review. This video is going to be about the history of the oil and gas industry, the things I lectured on. I'll give a separate review video on the geology portion. Now, I'm not going to try to reteach what Dr. Meadow has taught. Instead, I'm going to tell you, I'm asking you to get fairly high-level concepts out of Dr. Meadow's classes. And so now let me break that down specifically into what I expect. I'm going to go through the review on the oil and gas industry, and I'm going to make it very clear what was important. I had you read a series of pages in the Foundations of Petroleum book about the oil and gas industry history, and as I go through the slides, I'll specifically tell you what I think you should recall from that. And also, I had you read Chapter 1 of the prize, and I'm going to again give you some pretty clear ideas as to what you should get out of the readings of those materials. As far as the geology sections, I had you read that chapter in the Foundations of Petroleum. I'm not going to that chapter to lift out any specific questions. Rather, I hope that chapter got your knowledge up such that as Dr. Meadows is running through his fantastic presentations, more of that is able to stick with you. Now, my challenge is I try to only ask questions over things that I know that Dr. Meadow said repeatedly that are major themes. Obviously, that's going to be a bit of a problem with me for the lecture on Thursday night because I wasn't there. So I'll be meeting with him to make sure I understand what he really emphasized. And when I make the geology review video, which I probably won't make until Tuesday night after class, and I won't finalize the exam until Tuesday night after class for that matter, I'll be fairly clear about what I thought were the major themes that I really want you to hone in on. But trust me, with the geology stuff, I'm not going to ask you what is the measurement of porosity or permeability. I want you to understand very well the concept of porosity and permeability and how that matters as to the quality of a reservoir. So let's get started with the main topic for this review video, which is the oil and gas industry. And I'm not going to re-give the lectures, hooray for that. What I'm going to do is tell you what I expected you to get out of these items. So these are three key definitions that I hope everybody is well acquainted with. Not going to talk or not going to test that specifically. Also put down some early foundations, barrels of oil, how many gallons in a barrel of oil, BTUs, why is the concept of BOE important? Not going to talk about wind turbines at this on this exam. Talk about what does a barrel of oil produce in terms of the quantification, and what is the difference between light, heavy, sweet, sour, crude. I had you read the chapter on the prize. The real thing I want you to get out of this is that the oil, some key things that you see today in the oil and gas industry, we saw in the first 10 years of that history. So if you go back and reread that, what I want you to be queuing in on is, hey, what's the same today as it became in the late 1850s, 1860s, early 1870s in the oil industry? I don't really get into the international aspect. Standard Oil, certainly you should just be familiar with what these companies look like. And we talked about where did their monopoly arise and how did they impact that. As far as the oil discoveries in Texas, the textbook has a really good chapter about some of the significant drilling technologies that came to play with Spindletop. I want you to go back and reread that section, be familiar with that, because Spindletop was a very important well. Not going to test you on the names and the dates of these things. The one I want you to be familiar with also, though, is the Black Giant. And we talked about some important concepts that came out of the era around the Black Giant. Make sure you're well informed of those. Not going to test you on dates or locations of oil discoveries around the world. We did talk about, however, how the Seven Sisters impacted the development of oil assets around the world. So I want you to be familiar with the Seven Sisters and in general how the oil development went in those worlds. Then we talked about OPEC. So I don't give you too much of a history lesson because frankly I didn't ask you to read too much. So be familiar with this slide and then be familiar with the kind of the numbers that are represented in OPEC. Lots of histories about price fluctuations. I'm not going to expect you to memorize specific years, but I do want you to know uh, how we see how the crude oil market, um, I don't want to say is affected, but how it behaves in these sorts of variations. So you should remember what was going on in these regions. Was it a price or supply impact, and what happened? So do be familiar with this. Again, we talked about supply and demand, um, and we talked about how relatively small changes or small mismatches in supply and demand drive relatively wild changes in price. We also talked about where the market is made, the fact that there is speculation involved in the NYMEX. One of the things I'm not sure I emphasized enough is on the NYMEX is where they do a lot of the futures price. And again, you see some of this in the discussion of the price, but what you see reported usually is the spot price, which is the price for oil today. Um, we talked a lot about this chart, where the oil was located, the nature of the oil, the heavy tar sands in Venezuela and in Canada, especially in Canada for the tar sands. And we talked about the difference in the quality of oil with West Texas Intermediate and Brent being two worldwide benchmarks because they're very similar oils. Talked about the idea of who owns the oil. And then I want you to be very familiar with why there was this increase. And I want you to be very precise in why there was this increase in U.S. production. And again, I kind of illustrated that with these cool pictures of the United States at night. Also talked a lot about the spot price, where the market is made. For gas, it's the most common market maker is the Henry Hub Pipeline Nexus in Louisiana. And for oil, it's the Cushing, Oklahoma price. We talked about what happened, why the large spread for several years between WTI and Brent, and how that spread has largely gone away. It's important that you understand that because there's some key relationships there. I had you read two articles about peak oil and peak demand. I want you to be familiar with those articles. Um, Talked about uses. Actually, I don't have a particular exam question on this. Likewise, use of natural gas, no particular questions on this. In combination, this little chart inset and this chart are important. Because I didn't have my laser pointer, I wanted to make sure that you understand the locations of the major plays in the United States. So this is the Bakken up in principally North Dakota, some in South Dakota, some in Montana. This is the Permian Basin, is how it's referred. This is the Eagle Ford in South Texas. This is the Barnett Shale, which was not where fracking was discovered, because fracking has been around for decades, but where horizontal drilling with slickwater fracking was successful in busting apart shale rock, although you can see from the chart the amount of gas coming out of the Barnett is on the decline. The Haynesville Shale is another area where they're still doing a lot of natural gas drilling. There are plays up in here, but I didn't emphasize those, so I'm not going to ask you to remember those. And then this is commonly called the Marcellus Shale, and you can see from this chart that that is where a huge amount of gas is coming out. So I told you I wanted you to know the names and the locations of those plays, and so forewarned. Didn't talk about that. Some great conclusions, and this is what I really want you to remember going forward. We talked about how the world oil industry looks today, about how the national oil companies, which you can see what countries they're associated with, they control about 90% of the proved reserves. We talked about the IOCs, what makes an IOC and how there's been consolidation and why that consolidation was driven by market conditions. And then we looked at independence, what constitutes an independent in terms of the U.S., how prolific the independents are in drilling wells. No particular questions about the service companies, nor about the midstream companies, nor about the downstream companies. So, little closing summary there. Again, how I would study for the issue of the oil and gas history is I would go back and reread those pages that I illustrated in the Foundations of Petroleum, I would reread the chapter that I gave you out of the prize, paying particular attention to what looks today or sounds like today as I read this book. What similarities or differences do I see? And then I would go over these slides and make sure that you look carefully through your notes and you understand the discussions we had on these slides. Again, after Tuesday night's lecture, I'll be making a second video talking specifically about what I want you to get out of the geology lectures. If I didn't mention this earlier, and I apologize if I didn't, the exam is going to be 25 multiple choice questions worth 4 points each, and then there'll be 50 points on the exam constituting short answer questions. That's it for now.